Hello and good evening. I'm Melissa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. The plight of the urban poor is often overlooked. But when it's time for elections and campaigning heats up, we often see posed photos of cash handouts and food baskets and aid being given out, distributed to low-cost flats around the country. But will political parties include the fight against urban poverty in their manifestos, identifying the best approaches to target vulnerable communities who often fall through the cracks? My guest today is Dr. Carmelo Ferlito. He's the CEO of the Center for Market Education, and he recently co-authored a book titled Assessing and Addressing Urban Poverty in Malaysia. Carmelo, thank you so much for joining me on the show. Now, the crux of your book argues that instead of approaching poverty from the objective of quote-unquote eradication, policymakers should instead shift their approach to one of social mobility promotion. And I want to talk a little bit about that because this current approach to address poverty often focuses on aid and subsidy programs. How then, Carmelo, do you propose this policy approach be improved?
Yeah, first of all, good evening and thanks for having me and for having the chance to discuss the contents of the book. It's a pleasure. So far, the main gap that I see in the traditional approach to the fight of poverty is that we evaluate certain households, we judge them as having not enough resources to make ends meet, and we try, in extreme synthesis, to fill that financial gap with financial aids. But this, while could be a temporary short-term strategy, doesn't really eradicate poverty because maintains the people in the position of being unable to earn what they need and to remain dependent from governments for getting what they need. So this is a strategy also for long-term dependence mentality, which eventually can create, in the long term, the idea that we don't really need to improve our situation or to find the possibility to improve our situations because someone else is going to provide for it. So in the book, we say that the right approach should be, rather than giving the poor the resources to earn what they need, to put the poor in the position to earn that resources. So rather than giving the poor the resources, putting the poor in the condition to earn that resources. So, and this is the key concept of social mobility. So moving away the people out of poverty, not because they get cash handouts, but because they start doing something that make them in the position to go out of poverty. And then we have suggested several strategies, both institutional reforms or long-term reforms and more practical and short-term measures, let's say, to tackle this issue.
Okay, so when you say put them in a position to earn the resources for to promote social mobility, you're talking about entrepreneurship. And I do want to ask you about ensuring the efforts to promote entrepreneurship are worthwhile, because sometimes promoting entrepreneurship efforts it's not really just about increasing startup activity, having lots of micro SMEs. That doesn't guarantee social mobility. Carmelo, how do policy makers ensure that promoting entrepreneurship for social mobility, those efforts are sustainable?
Yeah, in fact, I believe that my idea also of promoting entrepreneurship is a bit different from what we usually listen in the normal conversation. So I'm not quite a big fan of supporting micro enterprises in the effort to support entrepreneurship. I have in mind something more radical than that, because a micro enterprise is often very, very fragile also. So, and I think that the basic issue doesn't really go back to capital, but back to mentality. So you can have all the capital you want, but if you don't have the mentality to exploit that capital for entrepreneurial purposes, then that capital remains simply idle, doesn't generate fruit. Okay. So, and I think this is the big challenge, is not really to promote the mushrooming of little enterprises, but to nurture culturally an idea that we provide for ourselves, that we need to fight for our own growth, and we need to find opportunities. And so entrepreneurship doesn't mean necessarily to become entrepreneur in the sense of having your own enterprise. It means more, in my idea, being entrepreneur of your own life. That means eventually also trying to look for good job opportunities in better companies or moving in a different country. So entrepreneur of your life rather than of a micro business. And I think here the biggest challenge is really on at educational level.
Could you elaborate? Because again, I'm fascinated by the idea that it's not really about capital, because we do have a lot of capital. There are multiple agencies looking at multiple initiatives and grant giving. And you're arguing that actually it's not really about giving grants or providing, microloans or providing capital to promote entrepreneurship. It's about creating that mindset. And that goes back to kind of institutional changes, structural changes within the education system. Could you elaborate a little bit, Carmelo?
Yes, I think that at this regard, we should focus mainly on two aspects. One, institutionally, and I think the aspect that bestly promote entrepreneurship is nurturing individual liberties. So getting the people understand that they are in power of their own life, first and foremost. And second is education. And I think that in education, the biggest block that we have now is an education system that is too much unbalanced toward scientific disciplines. I know that what I say is very much unpopular, and everybody thinks that in order to make money and grow in your career, you should be an engineer. But I want to challenge that. And I think that an engineer is someone that applies given knowledge to a problem. An entrepreneur is the person that finds new problems and new solutions to existing problems eventually. And in order to nurture this critical spirit, this critical mind, we need not more mathematics, but we need more humanities. We need more philosophy, more literature, more history. We need to be acquainted with the greatest changes and the greatest minds of the history of mankind. So philosophy, I think, can nurture entrepreneurs more than mathematics.
That's quite amazing. Okay, so if I understand this correctly, you're saying that individual liberty promotes creativity. So creativity cannot flourish, innovation cannot flourish under oppressed circumstances, and critical thinking are vital for entrepreneurship. All of that boiling down to the education system to promote entrepreneurship, to promote social mobility, to end or to fight urban poverty. I can see the links there, Carmelo. I do want to ask you whether this is reflected in government thinking, in current policy thinking. Was there anything in budget 2023 that was tabled but never debated? Do you think that there was anything there that reflected the way government is thinking about entrepreneurship in a way that might promote social mobility?
I didn't see this much in the budget, but to be fair, I think that probably the budget is also not the tool or the place where you want to see this. Is a more of a structural reform that needs an accurate debate in the parliament and in all the relevant places. So I hope that these conversations that we are having and our book can create also a space for this conversation. I know that there are some policymakers that are attentive to this kind of reflection. And I hope to see some of these proposals and some of these approaches reflected maybe in some points in some of the manifestos that are going to be revealed pretty soon.
The institutional educational reform, these are all long-term moves, approaches. These are things that we have to think about in the long term. But currently there are so many households undercounted even within urban areas that are struggling with urban poverty. What then would be the the measures for social mobility in the short term without having to wait for generational cycles?
Well, first of all, I think that the fact that certain proposals are long term and implies a vision should not stop us to starting working on it. Otherwise, we keep on delaying and nobody really works on the long term reform. And I agree with you that eventually this long term reform should temporarily be accompanied by more short-term measures. And in this regard, I think that a lot can be done with tax facilitations, first of all, and this is something that actually we have seen in the budget. I was very positive in seeing a reduction of income tax for certain income brackets. I think this is a good starting point, if it is compensated also with a cut in spending, obviously, otherwise we are going to enlarge the hole there, and this is not positive. But so to remain on that, I think we can also look at a more general fiscal reform where, in example, I have in mind certain instruments that have been developed in Italy, the so-called tax percentage designation institution, whereby individuals at the moment of the tax return can decide to allocate some of their taxes not to the government but to a certain charity organization or NGO or third sector enterprise, so that peoples are empowered in the choice of how some of their money are spent. This creates empowerment and also help to develop a more private-driven welfare state, which is financed with resources that otherwise would go to the government. This is one of the tools that I advocate. Another tool could be the idea of helping micro enterprises to emerge from the shadow economy in which they are now. So we can't help a lot of businesses or individuals because we don't know they exist. Okay, so they are outside of our watch. And Indonesia, in example, has developed a tax reform that is based on self-income declaration for micro enterprises. So they declare a certain amount of turnover, and they pay a fixed percentage, a very small percentage on the turnover. But on the other side, they don't have all other compliances. So it's a sort of agreement. It's already a step forward because these businesses, anyhow, they enter into the watch of the government and can eventually enter also in the possibility of receiving support. And finally, along these lines, I think also the promotion of more guarantee scheme loans. So rather than having the government working as a bank directly, but supporting the banks in supporting certain entrepreneurial initiative with a sort of guarantee where the government can earn a fee out of this guarantee and hopefully offset the loss of money for bad entrepreneurial initiatives with the money instead coming from good initiatives. So, I mean, these are all hypotheses and ideas that can be further discussed in their practical aspects, but they may help the strategy.
Definitely interesting, particularly those policies that have been adopted in other countries. Carmelo, thank you for speaking with me today. That was Carmelo Ferlito from the Center for Market Education, co-author of the recently published book, Assessing and Addressing Urban Poverty in Malaysia. We're going to take a quick break here and consider this. We'll be back with more. Stay tuned. Hi, welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris. Let's continue our discussion on urban poverty. My next guest is Benedict Weerasena. He's the Research Director at the Research Institute Bait Al-Amanah. He co-authored the book Assessing and Addressing Urban Poverty in Malaysia with Carmelo Ferlito from the Centre of Market Education. I just spoke to him a little bit earlier. Benedict, good to have you on the show.
Thank you.
On Consider This, I've tried to have an ongoing conversation about multidimensional poverty and the ways we need to look at poverty, the different dimensions of deprivation that will help us give us a more comprehensive picture of poverty in the country. But multidimensional poverty, that approach remains a challenge for policymakers to adopt. And so the default is an income-based benchmark to poverty measurement. I'm hoping, Benedict, you could start our conversation today by sharing a little bit about what you consider to be some of the issues that arise when we use an income-based poverty line.
Thank you, Melissa, for having me. So, as an overview, I think the issue with how we measure urban poverty really implies the policies that we take to address urban poverty. So, as just an overview, we have had issues of such as undercounting, exclusion of pockets of poverty, especially outliers falling through the gaps, inclusion and exclusion error also. And the reason why is because we have always been focusing on poverty line income, and this really shows how much is the issue of poverty that we are facing. Let me give you a very good example. In 2016, our poverty line income was only about 980 ringgit. And as a result of that, absolute poverty rate was 0.4%, which was very low. We virtually eradicated poverty. However, the reality is not so. So in 2019, we did an exercise to revise the poverty line income to 2,208 ringgit. As a result of that, the 2016 poverty rate, absolute poverty rate, was actually 7.6%. From 0.4, it rose to 7.6 just because we changed the poverty line income. That comes to show that poverty line income really determines how much of a problem that we're dealing here when it comes to poverty. So that is a good move by the government to actually increase the poverty line income. What I heard is that in 2023, this poverty line income will be revised again to a higher level. And then, especially as a result of the pandemic, we'll be able to see the extent of the problem that we are facing in Malaysia when it comes to absolute and hardcore poverty.
Okay, all right. So the poverty line income revised from 900 and I think was it 80? You said 980 to 2,208. That is quite a significant jump. Do you think that 2,208 ringgit as of 2019 is that in line with the country's cost of living, especially in urban areas? Do you expect a revised poverty line income in 2003 to have a significant jump? I'm asking because I think Bank Negara's minimum living wage is 2,700 for one adult living in KL. That's a big gap. Do you think that the poverty line income might adjust that much?
So I think referring to 2023, I believe that it should be adjusted even higher than 2,700 ringgit. Why? As we have seen post-pandemic, the cost of living has definitely increased. I mean, even just to give you a simple example, a plate of nasi campur with one meat and one vegetable used to cost about 6 to 7 ringgit in the heart of KL, but now it's already 8 or 9 ringgit on average. So things are getting more and more expensive, and because of that, the cost of living is certainly increasing. As a result, there is a need to evaluate once again the poverty line income based on the latest food prices, and also to incorporate new measurements of what households consider as nutritious food. So it's not just about using the old measurements based on the old food requirement, for example, but it's also being more current, up to date with what measurements we're using in terms of food, in terms of clothing, in terms of durables, housing, and transport. So things like this
Yeah.
have to be revised to make sure that it is updated with the times.
But what might that do, Benedict, to the poverty rate? So at a poverty line income of 2,209 in 2019, the poverty rate was 5.6%. If you're proposed higher than 2,700 ringgit poverty line, that might mean a significant increase in the poverty rate, a corresponding increase in the poverty rate of the country, might not go down very well with policymakers. It doesn't look good on the headlines, Benedict.
Definitely, I will have to agree with you. But interestingly, it's not just 5.6% in 2019, but the latest one is 2020, 8.4%. So it is increasing, but I believe people do understand, the general public does understand that the COVID pandemic has impacted many households. And if it raises, for example, to above 10%, I think people will still understand that it's better to be realistic about the numbers rather than hide behind a beautiful number of poverty rate and paint a picture that everything is all beautiful, but that's not the real case. So I believe nowadays with a much more informed general public, I think that they will be more understanding to realize that yes, the poverty rate is much higher now. Probably it could go up to 15%. I'm not sure because it really depends on how much the poverty line income, as long as there are policies being used to address this issue.
All right. But okay, so I agree with you that there's no point in having statistical sleight of hand if we're not catching all the people who really need the help. With a poverty, even if there was a revised poverty line income, are there still populations who might be excluded from being caught by the poverty rate, particularly in the urban poor? Are there populations of concern among the urban poor?
Yes, I would like to say that one group of people that always fall through the cracks when it comes to the measurement of poverty is really the non-Malaysians in our urban society. This includes documented and undocumented migrant workers, stateless communities, refugees, asylum seekers. Just to highlight one group, let's just focus on stateless communities for that matter. Stateless communities, it's a very, very sad situation because many of these families are generationally stateless. They are unable to get their documents. Some of them is just because of an error of not registering their birth certificate, for example. But many of them are born in Malaysia. Just to give you a picture of how bad the situation is, in West Malaysia, the latest statistics we have is about 12,400 stateless people in West Malaysia, but in Sabah and Sarawak, especially in Sabah, 800,000 stateless people. And all these are unaccounted for in the absolute poverty rate. Now, this is a group that we really need to focus on as a vulnerable group that needs, we can't just ignore this population. They are here to stay and they are part and parcel of Malaysian life. And I think we need to address urban poverty when it comes to stateless communities.
So how would policymakers do that? If the official poverty statistics only follow, the poverty line income, how do we make sure that the millions of non-citizens, including stateless people and refugees, they who are barred from working, barred from education and public healthcare, how do we make sure they are not falling through the cracks, as you pointed out?
I think for me, the most important policy that needs to be in place is educational opportunities. Something that we've pushed for in our institute as by Amanah is the Project Didik Semua Education for All project. This is aligned with SDG goal number 4, which is quality education for all. We believe that we cannot just rely on alternative learning centers for the stateless communities. I understand that it may be hard, it may take years, decades to get documents right, but that should never be a reason why a child should not be allowed to go to school or to attend formal education. Instead, there should be new measures. We shouldn't just use documentation as an excuse. There should be other ways, for example, to issue a student card, for example, for the stateless community so that they can actually join in to formal education. I think this will go a long way because we have seen how education empowers families to escape the poverty trap, especially intergenerational poverty. So we believe that education is something that is the most important. We've seen in other regional countries around our area that they promote education for stateless communities too. But unfortunately, Malaysia, we're not progressive enough to believe in this. So I'm hopeful that this changes.
All right, Benedict, thank you so much for joining me on the show. Benedict Weerasena there from Bait Al-Amanah, one of the co-authors of the book Assessing and Addressing Urban Poverty in Malaysia. That wraps up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching, and good night.